Imagine standing on the banks of the Detroit River. It's August 1812, sweltering heat. You're looking across the water at Fort Detroit, and on your side, you've got this coalition. A few thin lines of British regulars in their scarlet coats, Canadian militia who are, basically farmers, and then this powerful, massive army of Indigenous warriors, all of them brought together by one vision.
And they know they're outnumbered. That's the key. They can see the American garrison over there, and they know the numbers aren't on their side. But they're there for something bigger.
Exactly. This isn't just a battle. It's the violent edge between two totally competing ideas for what North America should be. You've got the huge land-hungry force of American Republican liberty on one side.
Yeah, and on the other, this really staunch conservative ideal of British imperial loyalty. That scene, it just perfectly captures the high-stakes world we're diving into today. The border wasn't just a line on a map. It was ideological.
It really was. So for those of you with us today, this is our custom deep dive. We're focusing strictly on the years between 1763 and 1815. It's this incredibly tumultuous half-century where Britain wins this massive empire from France.
And then immediately proceeds to lose most of it in the American Revolution.
Yes. And then they have to frantically scramble to just hold on to what's left. And in doing so, they sort of accidentally lay the groundwork for modern Canada with this really distinct conservative identity in the North.
And the sources we've been working with are just fascinating. We're looking at constitutional law, arguments about Indigenous sovereignty, and of course these two defining wars. Our mission really is to understand how the American Revolution and the War of 1812 permanently forged that boundary we see today.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at a crucial 50-year period where Britain essentially scrambled to hold on to what little it had left, inadvertently laying the foundation for something new.
It's a story of unintended consequences, absolutely. It
Yeah.
seems like every time they solved one problem, two more popped up somewhere else.
So just to set the stage, let's quickly recap where we left off. 1763, the Treaty of Paris has just been signed, ending the 7 Years' War.
Which Americans, of course, know as the French and Indian War. And with that treaty, France basically signs away all of its claims to North America. It's a huge gift to Great Britain.
A gift, but a very complicated one. Some historians call it a Pyrrhic victory.
Oh, absolutely. Britain gets a continent, but it also gets two enormous immediate problems. First, a colossal national debt, which they need to pay down by, taxing the colonies. We know how that went.
And second, they inherit this massive newly conquered population of about 70,000 French Catholic subjects, what used to be New France.
So they find themselves in this really strange position. They've beaten the French, but now they have to figure out how to govern this territory full of deeply loyal French Catholics while also trying to stop their own American colonists from flooding west.
And that appetite for land, as the sources call it, was just insatiable, wasn't it? Especially for the Ohio Valley.
It was. And that hunger for land leads directly to another war almost before the ink is dry on the treaty. Pontiac's War.
Which is the immediate spark that forces the British Crown to issue the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It's a desperate attempt to just restore some kind of order.
The proclamation did a few things, but for our purposes, the most important parts were how it dealt with the new province of Quebec, and critically, how it dealt with all that land to the west.
Okay, so Quebec is defined as what basically the lands that drain into the St. Lawrence River. It's kind of cut off from the interior.
Exactly, and that western interior is the real game changer. The proclamation establishes this vast region, basically everything west of the Appalachian Mountains, as territory reserved for Indigenous nations. And in doing that, it recognizes Aboriginal title.
I think we need to pause on that for a second. Aboriginal title, that's a really high-level legal concept. What did it actually mean on the Crown?
It was a very deliberate legal move. The proclamation stated very clearly that Indigenous land title could only be extinguished or, sold by the authority of the Crown.
So not by some random land speculator from Virginia.
No, not by a speculator, not by a colonial governor, not by anyone but the Crown, usually through a formal treaty process. The Crown was positioning itself as the sole intermediary, the protector of Indigenous territory against its own settlers.
So on one hand, this is designed to buy peace and encourage trust with Indigenous nations after the horrors of Pontiac's War. But on the other hand, it's also a tool to restrain the American colonists
That's the critical paradox, isn't it? The British are drawing this line down the spine of the Appalachians and telling their most ambitious and wealthy subjects, people like George Washington, who's already deep into Western land speculation, sorry, you can't cross this line.
And that, right there, becomes a foundational grievance for the Revolution.
Mm.
The colonists felt they had just fought and bled to win the Ohio Valley from the French.
Only to have London turn around and tell them it wasn't theirs to take, that it was legally reserved for someone else. They felt completely and utterly cheated.
But the proclamation also had rules for Quebec.
Huh.
And while it promised, no mass deportations like with the Acadians, the initial goal was pretty clear.
Right.
Anglicization.
Oh, yeah. The long-term plan was absolutely assimilation. They introduced English civil law, the French coutume de Paris kind of survived, but the political restrictions were the real issue. Catholics were forbidden from holding any public office.
Because you had to swear an oath rejecting the Pope.
Exactly, the test oath. So the message was clear. If you want any real power in this new British system, you're going to have to conform. You're going to have to become Protestant.
So they alienate the American settlers to try and placate the Indigenous nations while setting up a system in Quebec that's designed to eventually erase the French culture.
Yeah.
It's a lot of spinning plates.
And all of this is happening in the shadow of Pontiac's War, which we have to remember was not just some minor skirmish, it was a total breakdown of relations.
And it changed everything.
Yeah.
Historians point to this war as the first time both sides really embraced a policy of, well, what we would now call ethnic cleansing.
It was a radicalization of the conflict. Intolerance just skyrocketed. Indigenous people started seeing all Europeans as just whites, and Euro-Americans started seeing all the diverse Indigenous nations as just one hostile group, Indians.
And the sources on British military conduct are, frankly, they're shocking.
They are. The British forces were besieged, overwhelmed, and they resorted to some horrific tactics. The documents are pretty clear that their conduct included efforts to achieve victory through biological warfare.
Smallpox blankets.
Specifically, the distribution of smallpox-infected blankets at the siege of Fort Pitt. It marks this severe, chilling turn in British attitudes and a complete breakdown of any kind of partnership. This wasn't about coexistence anymore. It was about survival.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the next phase. About a decade later, Britain realizes its plan for Quebec is a complete failure.
A total failure. The test oath meant that the entire Canadian elite 70,000 people had absolutely no political voice. That brings us to the Quebec Act of 1774.
And this act really comes from the pragmatism of the governors on the ground, Murray and Carleton.
They could do the math. They had maybe 200 Protestant Anglo-merchant households in 1764. If they created an elected assembly like the proclamation wanted, that tiny, hostile minority would be governing the massive Catholic majority.
A recipe for disaster. As Carleton said, it would guarantee a severe backlash.
He saw what was already brewing in the 13 colonies and wanted no part of it. So instead of forcing Anglicization, he and Murray pushed for a policy of cautious tolerance. Secure their loyalty, don't provoke them.
They let the Catholic bishop, Jean-Olivier Briand, keep his influence. They let the seigneurial land system continue. They basically decided stability was more important than assimilation.
And when Carleton went back to London, that's the argument he made. And it worked. The Quebec Act of 1774 was a complete reversal of the 1763 policy.
So what did the Canadians get, specifically?
First, the goal of assimilation was just shelved. Catholics could now hold appointed offices because the test oath was replaced with a different oath they could take. Second, and this is huge, the legal system was split. British criminal law came in, but French civil law, the coutume de Paris, was fully recognized for all civil matters.
The coutume de Paris, let's break that down. Why was keeping that French civil code so important?
Because it governed everything to do with property, family, and inheritance. It was the legal foundation of the entire seigneurial system. If they had imposed English common law, it would have wiped out the social and economic power of the seigneurs, the Canadian aristocracy, overnight.
So by protecting their legal system and also allowing the Catholic Church to start collecting tithes again, the British basically bought the loyalty of the Canadian elite.
They did. They created a conservative alliance, they respected the traditional social order, and in return, that elite kept the population loyal to the crown.
A brilliant move for keeping Quebec stable, but an absolute disaster for relations with the colonies to the south.
Oh, the Americans were furious. The Quebec Act was immediately lumped in with what they called the Intolerable Acts. It was seen as just another piece of London's tyranny.
And they were outraged on two main fronts, right? Land and religion.
Let's start with the land. The Quebec Act didn't just change the laws inside Quebec, it changed the borders massively.
The map just gets redrawn overnight.
It does. The new boundary of Quebec was extended all the way down into the Ohio Valley to the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. So that land, the prize the Virginians and Pennsylvanians felt they had won in 1763, was suddenly being governed by this appointed Catholic-friendly government in Quebec. They felt cheated all over again.
And then there's the religious aspect. The irony that the American fight for liberty was, in this case, profoundly anti-Catholic.
It's a huge irony. The Continental Congress just went on the attack. They called Catholicism a bloodthirsty, idolatrous, and hypocritical creed. They were genuinely horrified that the British Parliament would give legal protection to the Catholic Church.
So Britain provides the Continental Congress with two perfect propaganda tools: fear of Catholicism and anger over the Western lands.
Exactly. And that deep-seated religious hostility is a big reason why, when the Americans invaded Quebec in 1775, the Canadians didn't join them. The clergy preached against the Americans, reminding everyone that the Quebec Act protected their faith and their property, while these invaders had called their religion idolatrous.
So the invasion fails, the revolution succeeds, and we get to the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And for the North, the biggest immediate impact is this massive wave of refugees, the Loyalists.
The Loyalist exodus is a fundamentally transformative event for British North America. You have somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people fleeing north. They've lost their homes, their property, their status, and they arrive with a fierce, baked-in conservatism and loyalty to the crown.
And they weren't just one monolithic group of, rich Tories.
Not at all. That's a crucial point. The migration included thousands of formerly enslaved African Americans who had won their freedom by fighting for the British. For them, the crown represented liberty, not the republic. And it also included thousands of Indigenous allies, especially the Kanyen-Kahak, the Mohawks, led by Joseph Brant, who had to abandon their ancestral lands in New York.
So where did all these people go?
They overwhelmed the existing colonies. The biggest group, maybe 30,000, went to Nova Scotia. There were so many of them, and they had such different political ideas from the older settlers there that it forced the British to partition the colony.
And that's how we get New Brunswick.
Exactly. New Brunswick was created in 1784 specifically as a Loyalist colony for Loyalists to be governed by Loyalists.
And then about 10,000 went to what was still the province of Quebec.
Yes, and they settled mostly in the west along the north shore of Lake Ontario. And they immediately started demanding English laws, freehold land tenure, everything they had just lost. They had no interest in living under the French seigneurial system.
So the very people who helped defend Quebec from the Revolution now demanded that the Quebec Act, the thing that kept Quebec loyal, be scrapped to accommodate them.
It's another one of those great ironies. And it forces Britain's hand again. They need yet another constitutional solution.
Which brings us to the Constitutional Act of 1791.
Precisely. This act was designed to solve the Loyalist problem. The main goal was to separate the English-speaking Protestant newcomers from the French-speaking Catholic majority. It was seen as the only way to keep the peace.
So they split the old province of Quebec right down the middle?
Well, down the Ottawa River, more or less. You get Lower Canada, which is the old heartland in the St. Lawrence Valley. It stays predominantly French and Catholic, and it keeps the Coutume de Paris. And then you get Upper Canada.
Everything to the west. Modern southern Ontario.
Exactly. A colony designed from the ground up for the Anglophone Loyalists, with British common law and freehold land tenure.
And the man they put in charge of building Upper Canada, John Graves Simcoe, was not just an administrator. He was a true believer.
An absolute true believer. He was a veteran of the Revolution, and he despised the American Republican experiment. He saw it as a moral failure. His goal wasn't just to run a colony. It was to create a society so stable, so prosperous, so superior, that it would eventually tempt the Americans to abandon their republic and return to the crown.
He's trying to build an anti-America right on the border.
That's the perfect way to put it, an anti-Republican utopia. And the way he planned to do it was through the constitutional structure itself.
Okay, so both colonies get an elected assembly. That sounds democratic.
It sounds it, but it was democracy with very, very firm guardrails. The elected assembly had very little actual power. The real authority was held by two appointed councils, the Executive Council and the Legislative Council.
And these councils were filled with...
Simcoe's friends, the Loyalist elite, the wealthy, the connected. This structure created what we call an oligarchy. In Lower Canada, they became known as the Chateau Clique, and in Upper Canada, the Family Compact.
So the system was deliberately designed to stop popular democracy from getting out of hand.
at every turn.
Yeah.
The governor could veto any law, he could dissolve the assembly. The whole point was to ensure that the appointed loyal elite always had the final say. It was meant to guarantee peace, order, and good government.
Which is the perfect contrast to the American life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One is about collective stability, the other about individual freedom.
And that phrase, peace, order, and good government, becomes the defining creed of British North America. But there was a huge problem with Simcoe's plan.
He needed people.
He needed people. To build his utopia, he needed a population. So he started offering huge incentives. Free land, 200 acres a person, very low taxes, and people came flooding in.
The late Loyalists.
Yeah. By 1812, the population of Upper Canada had exploded to about 75,000 people. But the sources are clear. 3/5 of them, the vast majority, were Americans who came after the Revolution just for the free land.
Their loyalty was questionable at best.
To say the least. Their loyalty was never certain. Many of them had stronger economic and family ties to New York and Pennsylvania than they did to Britain. They were often critical of the Tory elite. They were not the loyal subjects Simcoe had envisioned.
So you have this colony that's supposed to be a bastion of British loyalty, and the majority of its residents might actually side with the Americans if they invade.
It was a huge source of anxiety. The true loyalists were terrified of these fifth columns living among them. It made the colony incredibly vulnerable and much more dependent on British troops and, crucially, on their Indigenous allies for security.
Which takes us to the West. While all this is happening in the Canadas, the Indigenous nations are fighting their own desperate battle to hold the line against American expansion.
A continuous, brutal struggle. After 1783, the U.S. government no longer felt bound by the Proclamation line. They saw the West as conquered territory. This immediately sparks the Northwest Indian War,
where a confederacy of nations, the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, and others, came together to resist.
And they were shockingly successful at first. In 1791, they completely destroyed an American army under General St. Clair. It was one of the worst defeats the U.S. Army ever suffered. It really shook the young republic.
But the success didn't last. The Americans came back under General Mad Anthony Wayne and defeated the Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794.
And that led to the Treaty of Greenville, which forced the cession of most of what is now Ohio. It was a massive loss of land and pushed the frontier further west.
And all through this period, the British were playing a double game, weren't they? They were supposed to hand over their western forts like Detroit, but they held on to them for years.
They did. Their policy was one of quiet support for anyone who was harassing the Americans. They saw the Indigenous nations as a vital military buffer for the very vulnerable Upper Canada. So they supplied them with guns, ammunition, and advice. They were trying to keep the Americans off balance.
Which, of course, the Americans knew and resented.
Deeply. The pressure on Indigenous nations just kept building into the early 1800s, especially from governors like William Henry Harrison in Indiana Territory. And this political pressure coincided with a devastating wave of diseases.
Smallpox, influenza.
Yeah.
The sources say they just swept through communities after 1805, creating this immense social and spiritual crisis.
And out of that crisis rise two of the most extraordinary leaders in North American history, the Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa.
Tenskwatawa is known as the prophet. He's the spiritual leader.
Right. He starts a religious revival, telling people to reject all Euro-American ways. Reject the alcohol, the technology, the clothing, the Christianity, and return to the old ways. He builds Prophetstown on the Wabash River, and it becomes this huge spiritual center for thousands of people from many different nations.
So Tenskwatawa is feeding the soul of the movement, and his brother, Tecumseh, provides the political and military strategy.
Tecumseh's vision was just breathtaking in its scope. He argued for a unified pan-Indigenous political front. Forget ancient tribal divisions, he said. We must act as one people. But his core argument was legal. He argued for the common ownership of Indigenous land.
Meaning what exactly?
He said that the land belonged to all Indigenous people collectively. No single tribe, no single chief had the right to sell it. Any land cession had to be approved by all the nations.
Which is a direct challenge to Harrison's whole strategy of picking off weak chiefs one by one.
A brilliant and direct challenge. Harrison, of course, saw this as an existential threat. So in 1811, while Tecumseh is away in the south trying to recruit more allies, Harrison attacks.
He marches on Prophetstown, the Battle of Tippecanoe.
He attacks the town, scatters the residents, and burns it to the ground. It was a military disaster for the movement.
But politically, it proved Tecumseh's entire point.
It confirmed everything he'd been saying. Look, he could say, this is what happens when we are divided. This is what the Americans will do. The destruction of Prophetstown is what galvanizes Tecumseh to make his final, critical decision to seek a formal military alliance with the British.
And the British, seeing that war with the U.S. is pretty much inevitable at this point, are more than ready to listen.
They know that Tecumseh's Confederacy is probably the only thing that can save Upper Canada from an American invasion.
So the stage is set. 1812. The Americans declare war. Why?
Well, there are the maritime reasons that everyone learns about. British interference with shipping, impressing American sailors into the Royal Navy. But for the war hawks in Congress, the real passionate reason was the western frontier.
They were convinced the British were arming and inciting the Indigenous resistance.
Which they were. The war hawks wanted a second war of independence. And for them, that meant conquering Canada and removing the British from the continent for good.
But the British position was incredibly weak. They were fighting Napoleon in Europe. They had very few regular troops to spare for North America.
Which is why the Indigenous allies weren't just helpful, they were essential. The sources are absolutely clear on this. British regulars alone could not have stemmed the tide.
And this is where we see that remarkable alliance form between the British commander, General Isaac Brock, and Tecumseh.
It was a relationship built on immediate mutual respect. Brock saw Tecumseh's genius right away. He wrote, "A more sagacious or a more gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist." They were a formidable team.
And their first major act together, the capture of Detroit, is a masterclass in psychological warfare.
Pure genius. They march on Detroit in August 1812. They're outnumbered, but they use tricks to exaggerate their numbers. They have their Indigenous warriors march in a loop through a clearing so it looks like they have thousands more than they do. And they play on the American general's absolute terror of an unbridled Indigenous attack.
And he surrenders, with barely a shot fired.
He surrenders the entire fort. It's a massive, stunning victory that makes the entire American Northwest vulnerable and inspires more nations to join Tecumseh.
But that was the high point, wasn't it? The tide turns pretty quickly in 1813.
It does. The Americans win control of Lake Erie, which cuts off the British supply lines to the west. The new British general, Proctor, is no Isaac Brock. He orders a retreat, and it's a disaster.
Which leads to the Battle of the Thames or Moraviantown.
The final, decisive battle, October 5th, 1813. Proctor's retreating forces, with Tecumseh's warriors fighting a rearguard action, are caught and destroyed by a much larger American force led by William Henry Harrison.
The old nemesis.
The old nemesis. Tecumseh is killed in the battle, and with his death, the dream of a unified Indigenous confederacy of a sovereign homeland in the Great Lakes dies with him. It just perishes.
The warriors disperse. The alliance shatters. The dream of a buffer state between the U.S. and British North America is gone forever.
It's the central tragedy of the war. When the Treaty of Ghent is signed in 1815 to end the fighting, it basically just restores the old borders. But the Indigenous nations are left out of the negotiations. They're left alone to face American expansion.
And yet, even though the war ended in a stalemate, it had this huge cultural legacy for what would become Canada.
A massive legacy. It was a myth-building moment.
Yeah.
The fact that Upper Canada, with its suspect population, had successfully fought off the American invasion was seen as a profound victory. It cemented the idea that the two North American entities were separate and distinct for good.
And it supercharged that conservative loyalist identity.
Absolutely. The Tory elite, the family compact, their power was strengthened. The war became the founding story of their colony, the moment when the people chose British loyalty and peace, order, and good government over American anarchy.
So the anti-democratic structures built into the 1791 Constitution weren't weakened by the war. They were entrenched for another generation.
And that had a direct impact on their former allies. After 1815, the military value of the Indigenous nations plummeted. So the relationship changes. It's no longer a partnership. It becomes paternalism.
They go from allies to a problem to be managed.
Exactly. The British commitments grow stale. The goal shifts from military alliance to assimilation, to turning Indigenous peoples into Christian farmers, to be absorbed into settler society. The border was sealed, the buffer was gone, and they were now on the inside to be managed.
So if we look back at this whole half century, from 1763 to 1815, what does it all mean? It seems like a story of Britain trying to do two contradictory things at once.
I think so. They're trying to appease their French Catholic subjects with the Quebec Act, while also trying to appease their Indigenous allies with the Royal Proclamation. And both of those solutions just enraged the American colonists.
So it's a story of strategic failure. Really. The Americans get their independence, the Indigenous nations lose their land and their military power.
And the only lasting result is the creation of these two very different North American political entities. You have the Republican United States, defined by expansion and democracy, and then you have British North America, defined by its loyalism, its conservatism, and its deep suspicion of that very democracy.
The border is no longer just a line on a map. It's hardened by war and by two opposing ideologies.
And it's fascinating that the failure of British policy that led to the Revolution created the very loyalist population that was essential to saving the northern colonies in the next war. It linked conservatism and survival together in the Canadian psyche.
The guns fall silent in 1815. The borders are set. But this awkward collection of colonies, now defined by its fear of democracy, almost immediately starts to face rebellion from within. The stage is really set for the next big struggle, which isn't against an external enemy, it's a fight for democracy itself.
That's right. As the family compact and Chateau clique dig in their heels, you see the pressure building that will lead to the rebellions of 1837. And at the same time, as the British sphere pushes west, it's going to run into a formidable new identity, the Métis-Souhain, forged from those same French and Indigenous connections Britain had so much trouble managing in Quebec. Their story is the next great challenge to the north.